On the night of September 26, 1983, a Soviet military officer sat in an underground bunker south of Moscow and made a decision that determined whether hundreds of millions of people would live or die before sunrise. The detection systems under his command reported an incoming nuclear attack from the United States. Military protocol required immediate escalation to Soviet leadership. He chose to wait. The world never knew how close it came to ending. September 1983 represented the most dangerous month of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis, a period when the accumulated weight of political miscalculation, technological vulnerability, and mutual paranoia had pushed the United States and Soviet Union closer to nuclear exchange than at any point in the previous 2 decades. On September 1st, Soviet fighters had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after the civilian Boeing 747 accidentally entered Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island, killing all 269 passengers and crew, including United States Congressman Lawrence McDonald. The Reagan administration condemned the attack as a deliberate massacre, while Soviet leadership insisted the aircraft had been on an intelligence-gathering mission, and the resulting diplomatic crisis severed already fragile communication channels between Washington and Moscow at precisely the moment when both sides needed them most. The Soviet military had operated under heightened alert status throughout the year due to Operation Ryan, a massive intelligence collection program that reflected genuine paranoia among Soviet leadership that the United States was preparing a nuclear first strike disguised as a routine military exercise, similar to how Nazi Germany had concealed Operation Barbarossa in 1941. American military exercises scheduled for November, codenamed Able Archer 83, would simulate NATO nuclear release procedures with such realism that Soviet intelligence agencies would interpret them as potential cover for an actual attack. But on September 26th, the immediate threat came not from deliberate aggression, but from the possibility that automated systems designed to provide warning could instead trigger the catastrophe they were meant to prevent. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov had spent 18 years in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, specializing in the development and operation of early warning systems that detected intercontinental ballistic missile launches through a network of satellites known as OKO, the Russian word for eye, which monitored the United States from geosynchronous orbit and transmitted infrared data to bunkers like Serpukhov 15, where Petrov served. He had not been scheduled to work on September 26th, but replaced a colleague who had called in sick, a circumstance that placed him in command of the night shift, at the exact moment when the system he had helped develop would face its first apparent confirmation of the nuclear attack scenario that planners had wargamed for decades. Petrov understood the technical limitations of OKO better than most officers in the Soviet military, because he had participated in testing the satellites before their deployment and knew that the system had never been fully validated under real-world conditions that included variables like atmospheric interference, cloud cover at specific angles, and sunlight reflection during seasonal transitions, particularly during the autumn equinox period when the angle of sunlight relative to the satellite's sensors created conditions that had never been thoroughly tested. He also carried the personal burden of understanding that his professional reputation depended on the reliability of a system that senior Soviet military officials had criticized as insufficient compared to the ground-based radar networks that NATO countries maintained, creating institutional pressure to validate OKO's effectiveness, even when the data seemed questionable. At 44 years old, Petrov had built his career on technical expertise rather than political connections, a path that had earned him respect among engineers and scientists, but had also limited his advancement within a military hierarchy that often valued ideological reliability and party loyalty above specialized knowledge, meaning that any mistake he made on this shift could effectively end his career, while any hesitation to report a genuine attack could result in the destruction of his country. The command bunker at Serpukhov 15 sat approximately 60 miles south of Moscow, connected to Soviet military headquarters through redundant communication lines that ensured any warning of incoming attack would reach the General Staff and ultimately General Secretary Yuri Andropov within minutes of detection. Petrov had arrived for his shift shortly after midnight on September 26th, reviewing the previous shift's reports and checking the satellite feed connections that displayed real-time data from OCO's constellation of early warning satellites positioned to monitor missile fields across the continental United States and submarine-launched ballistic missile patrol areas in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The bunker's atmosphere reflected the broader tension that had gripped Soviet military installations since the Korean airliner incident 3 weeks earlier, with officers discussing rumors that NATO forces in Europe had increased their readiness levels and that American strategic bombers had modified their patrol patterns in ways that suggested preparation for offensive operations rather than routine deterrence posture. The duty shift included approximately 20 officers and technicians responsible for monitoring different aspects of the detection system, analyzing the raw data streams from satellites, and maintaining direct communication lines to Moscow, but ultimate authority for determining whether an alert represented a genuine attack or a technical malfunction rested with the shift commander, which meant that on this particular night, the decision belonged entirely to Petrov. The command center occupied a reinforced underground facility designed to survive near-miss nuclear detonations and continue operating long enough to transmit warning to Soviet leadership, though everyone understood that if American missiles were actually inbound, the personnel at Serpukhov 15 would likely not survive the initial exchange, regardless of the bunker's hardened construction. Just after midnight local time, corresponding to early evening on September 25th in the United States, one of the display screens in the command center switched from its standard monitoring mode to an alert status that Petrov had seen only during training exercises and system tests. The computer system designated as part of OCO's ground processing network had analyzed infrared data from satellite sensors and determined with high confidence that a single intercontinental ballistic missile had launched from a site in the United States and was following a trajectory toward Soviet territory. Protocol required Petrov to immediately report the detection through the military command chain, initiating a process that would wake senior officers and potentially reach the General Secretary himself. But Petrov's training in the system's technical specifications made him hesitate because a single missile launch contradicted every war plan and strategic doctrine that both superpowers had developed over the previous 3 decades. American nuclear doctrine called for massive retaliation in the event of war, not a single exploratory launch that would accomplish nothing except to guarantee Soviet counterattack before the first warhead detonated. And Petrov knew that if the United States had actually decided to launch a first strike, the early warning system would detect not one missile, but hundreds arriving simultaneously to overwhelm Soviet defenses. The computer's high confidence assessment troubled him, because the algorithm had been programmed by engineers who understood mathematics but not military strategy. And while the satellite sensors might have accurately detected an infrared signature consistent with a missile launch, the strategic implausibility of a single missile attack suggested either a technical malfunction or a misinterpretation of data that the automated system lacked the context to recognize. The alert system continued to update every few seconds as the satellite maintained its tracking lock on the apparent missile trajectory. Additional screens activated. The system now reported 5 separate missiles, 5 launches detected with high confidence, all following ballistic paths toward Soviet targets. The display showed trajectory projections that indicated the missiles would impact Soviet territory in approximately 20 to 25 minutes if they were real, though ground-based radar systems that should have confirmed the satellite detection remained silent because the missiles had not yet crossed the horizon, where Soviet radar installations could track them. The bunker's other officers looked to Petrov for orders. The protocol was explicit and unambiguous. Military regulations required immediate notification to higher command. The information would reach Soviet leadership within minutes, triggering emergency procedures that had been rehearsed countless times but never executed with actual incoming missiles potentially destroying Soviet cities, while commanders debated response options. Someone would have to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike before American missiles destroyed Soviet command and control capabilities, and that decision would need to be made within minutes based on information that Petrov would provide. Petrov knew that once he picked up the phone to the general staff, he would start a process he could not stop, a cascade of alerts and emergency protocols that would force senior officers, and potentially the general secretary himself, to make irreversible decisions based on data that Petrov himself doubted. Petrov's decision to delay the notification violated every regulation in the Soviet military's command structure, but he understood that the regulations had been written by officers who trusted the technology more than the engineers who built it trusted themselves. The OCO satellite system had been operational for less than 2 years and had never detected an actual missile launch from the United States, meaning that every alert the system generated existed in a data vacuum, where historical precedent provided no guidance, and where the consequences of a false positive could be as catastrophic as failing to detect a real attack. Petrov had attended classified briefings where Soviet military scientists acknowledged that the infrared sensors could theoretically mistake high-altitude cloud formations or sunlight, reflecting off clouds at specific angles for the heat signature of a missile launch, particularly during the autumn and spring equinoxes, when the sun's position relative to the satellites created lighting conditions that had not been adequately tested before the system became operational. The timing of the alert bothered him because it had occurred just after midnight Moscow time, which corresponded to the period when the satellite's orbit would position it to observe the United States during late afternoon or early evening local time, when sunlight conditions created the most challenging environment for distinguishing between actual missile plumes and atmospheric reflections. He also questioned why ground-based radar installations had not confirmed the satellite detection within the first minute of the alert, since Soviet radar networks in Siberia and the Far East should have been able to track missiles approaching Soviet airspace once they reached sufficient altitude to clear the horizon. And the absence of radar confirmation suggested that either the missiles were following trajectories that somehow avoided detection, or more likely that the satellites had misidentified something else as missile launches. The officers and technicians in the command center waited for Petrov to issue orders, their training and every drill they had participated in, telling them that protocol required immediate escalation to higher command regardless of the shift commander's personal doubts about the data. Military regulations existed precisely to prevent individual officers from making subjective judgments about intelligence that could determine national survival. And by hesitating to report the alert, Petrov was effectively substituting his own technical analysis for the collective wisdom of Soviet military doctrine that had been developed over decades by officers far more senior than a lieutenant colonel on night duty. The direct communication line to the general staff sat on Petrov's desk, a dedicated phone that required only lifting the receiver to connect immediately with the duty officer at Soviet military headquarters, who would then initiate emergency notification procedures that would reach the highest levels of command within minutes. Several of the officers in the bunker had already moved to their stations to prepare the formal alert report that regulations required them to transmit once Petrov gave the order, and their readiness to execute protocol created additional pressure on Petrov to either make the notification or explicitly countermand the system's alert and take personal responsibility for potentially ignoring a genuine attack. The stakes of being wrong in either direction were absolute, because if he reported a false alarm, he would trigger a crisis that could escalate into nuclear war based on erroneous data. But if he failed to report a real attack, he would deny Soviet leadership the minutes they needed to decide whether to launch retaliatory strikes before American missiles destroyed Soviet command centers and eliminated the possibility of coordinated response. Petrov ordered his staff to maintain their positions and continue monitoring all systems, while he personally analyzed the satellite data and waited for ground-based radar confirmation that military doctrine stated should arrive within 2 to 3 minutes of any actual missile launch that the satellites detected. He understood that his career and possibly his life depended on being correct, because Soviet military justice treated failures that endangered national security as criminal acts rather than simple mistakes, and the political climate in 1983 made any officer who undermined military readiness vulnerable to accusations of incompetence, or worse. The senior officers who would review his actions would ask why he had trusted his own judgment over the automated system's high-confidence assessment, and Petrov would need to explain his reasoning in terms that made sense to people who had not participated in developing the technology and who might view his hesitation as evidence of weakness or disloyalty rather than technical expertise. His subordinates in the command center understood that they would also face consequences if Petrov's decision proved wrong, either because they had followed orders to delay notification of a real attack, or because they had failed to override a commander who was making a catastrophic error, creating a situation where everyone in the bunker shared responsibility for whatever happened in the next few minutes. The clock on the wall showed that nearly 3 minutes had elapsed since the initial alert, and if the missiles were real, they would impact Soviet territory in approximately 20 to 25 minutes, which meant that Soviet leadership had perhaps 15 minutes remaining to decide whether to order retaliatory launches before losing the command and control infrastructure necessary to execute a coordinated counterstrike. The satellite data continued to show 5 missiles tracking towards Soviet targets, and the computer's confidence level remained high with no indication of system malfunction or error. Petrov pulled up the raw sensor data on his screen, examining the infrared signatures that the automated system had classified as missile launches, and looking for anomalies that might indicate a false detection. The signatures showed bright infrared sources moving against the background of space, consistent with the heat plumes that intercontinental ballistic missiles would generate during their boost phase when rocket motors propelled them out of the atmosphere toward their ballistic trajectories. However, the intensity and duration of the infrared signatures seemed inconsistent with what Petrov remembered from the test data he had reviewed during the system's development, and the fact that all 5 detections had occurred within a very short time window suggested a systematic issue rather than 5 independent missile launches. Ground-based radar should have detected the missiles by now if they were real, and the continued absence of radar confirmation strengthened Petrov's suspicion that the satellite system had malfunctioned or misidentified something else as missile launches. One of the junior officers approached Petrov's station and quietly informed him that regulations required notification within 5 minutes of initial detection, and that the time limit was approaching. The communications officer stood ready at the phone line to the general staff. Other officers in the bunker had stopped their routine monitoring tasks. Everyone was watching Petrov. The protocol was clear. 5 missiles detected. High confidence. No confirmation that it was a false alarm. Report it now. Let senior commanders make the decision. That was what regulations required. That was what his training demanded. Petrov looked at the screen showing the 5 missile tracks. He thought about the sunlight angle. He thought about the lack of radar confirmation. He thought about the strategic absurdity of a 5-missile attack. Then he picked up the phone. Petrov reported the alert to the general staff as a system malfunction rather than an incoming attack, a classification that represented his professional judgment that the satellite data did not constitute sufficient evidence of a genuine missile launch despite the automated system's high confidence assessment. He informed the duty officer at Soviet military headquarters that the early warning satellites had generated an alert indicating possible missile launches from the United States, but that ground-based radar had failed to confirm the detection, and that the strategic profile of the alert was inconsistent with American nuclear doctrine, which called for massive simultaneous launches rather than a limited strike that would accomplish nothing except to guarantee Soviet retaliation. The duty officer asked Petrov to confirm his assessment and to state explicitly whether he was reporting an attack or a false alarm, and Petrov stated that in his judgment, the satellite system had malfunctioned and that no attack was in progress, knowing that this assessment placed his career and possibly his freedom at risk if he was wrong. The duty officer accepted Petrov's report and informed him that the notification would be logged as a technical issue rather than an attack warning, which meant that emergency protocols would not be activated and that Soviet leadership would not be woken to make decisions about nuclear retaliation. And after the call ended, Petrov sat at his station watching the countdown timer that showed how many minutes remained before the missiles would impact Soviet territory, if they were real. He had made his decision based on technical analysis and strategic logic, but he would not know with absolute certainty whether he was correct until the projected impact time passed without any detonations, or until ground-based radar finally detected missiles crossing Soviet airspace. And in the minutes that followed, he experienced what he would later describe as the longest period of his life, sitting in the underground bunker surrounded by subordinates who knew their commander had just bet their country's survival on his personal judgment against the computer system's assessment. The satellite data continued to show 5 missiles tracking toward Soviet targets, and the computer maintained its classification of the detections as high-confidence missile launches with no indication that the system recognized any error or uncertainty in its analysis. Petrov ordered continuous monitoring of all ground-based radar installations across the Soviet Union, particularly the installations in Siberia and the Far East that should detect any missiles approaching from trajectories across the Pacific Ocean, or the polar regions where American intercontinental ballistic missiles would travel to reach Soviet territory from launch sites in the continental United States. The radar operators reported negative contact on all systems, meaning that despite the satellite's persistent detection of 5 missiles, not a single ground-based radar had tracked any objects consistent with incoming ballistic missiles. And this absence of radar confirmation represented the strongest evidence supporting Petrov's assessment that the satellite had malfunctioned. Soviet military doctrine required redundant confirmation of attack warnings, precisely because planners understood that no single detection system was infallible, and the doctrine specified that satellite detections should be confirmed by ground radar before initiating emergency notification to political leadership, though the regulations also stated that in situations where time was critical, the duty officer could escalate alerts based on satellite data alone if the confidence level was sufficiently high. Petrov had effectively decided that the doctrine's requirement for redundant confirmation outweighed the regulations about immediate escalation, a judgment that reflected his technical knowledge of the satellite system's limitations, but that also contradicted the explicit chain of command procedures that gave computer systems priority over human assessment in ambiguous situations. The clock on the wall advanced through the minutes that represented the flight time for intercontinental ballistic missiles traveling from the United States to Soviet territory, and as each minute passed without radar detection or impact, the probability increased that the satellite alert had been false. Petrov used the time to review every aspect of the satellite data, examining the infrared signatures in detail and comparing them to archived test data from the system's development phase when engineers had validated the sensor's ability to distinguish missile launches from other infrared sources, including industrial facilities, forest fires, and atmospheric phenomena. The signatures from the current alert showed characteristics that troubled him because the infrared intensity fluctuated in ways that seemed inconsistent with actual rocket motors, and the timing of the detections suggested they might be related to the satellite's orbital position relative to the Sun, rather than to actual events on the ground. Engineers who had worked on OCO's development had warned that high-altitude clouds could reflect sunlight directly into the satellite's sensors at specific angles, creating infrared signatures that the automated analysis system might classify as missile launches. And while the engineers had attempted to program filters that would reject such false detections, the system had never been tested under the full range of atmospheric and lighting conditions that could occur during actual operations. The current alert had occurred during a period when the satellite's orbit would place it in a position where sunlight reflecting off clouds over the continental United States could create exactly the type of false signature that engineers had worried about, and this possibility strengthened Petrov's confidence that he had made the correct assessment, even as he understood that absolute confirmation would only come when the projected impact time passed without any missiles striking Soviet territory. 20 minutes had elapsed since the initial alert, and ground-based radar still showed no contacts consistent with incoming missiles. The officers in the command center began to relax slightly as the realization spread that Petrov's assessment appeared to be correct, and that the satellite had indeed generated a false alarm rather than detecting a genuine attack. However, regulations required continued monitoring until the maximum flight time for intercontinental ballistic missiles had fully elapsed, meaning that Petrov and his staff would need to maintain their alert status for several more minutes before they could definitively conclude that no attack was in progress. The satellite data had finally begun to change as the infrared signatures that the system had classified as missile launches faded and disappeared, a pattern consistent with the satellite's losing tracking lock on objects that had never been missiles in the first place, but rather transient atmospheric phenomena that had briefly generated infrared returns matching the system's classification parameters for rocket plumes. 30 minutes after the initial alert, with no radar detections and no impacts, Petrov officially classified the event as a false alarm and directed his staff to begin documenting the incident for the formal report that regulations required after any alert. The satellite system had apparently mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for missile launches, exactly the scenario that engineers had warned about during the system's development, but that senior military officers had dismissed as unlikely. The immediate crisis had passed. No missiles had been launched from the United States. Soviet leadership had not been placed in a position where they needed to decide whether to order retaliatory strikes. The world had not ended. Petrov had been correct, but he also understood that his decision to override the automated system and delay notification to senior command represented a violation of protocol that would require explanation and justification to officers who might not appreciate the technical reasoning behind his actions. The phone on his desk rang. It was the general staff calling back. They had questions about his report. The investigation into the September 26th incident concluded that Petrov had been correct about the satellite malfunction, but wrong to have violated protocol by delaying notification to senior command, a finding that reflected the Soviet military's institutional preference for strict adherence to regulations, regardless of circumstances or outcomes. The technical analysis confirmed that the OCO satellites had detected sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds at an angle that occurred only during the autumn equinox period, creating infrared signatures that the automated system classified as missile launches because the computer lacked the contextual understanding to distinguish between rocket plumes and atmospheric reflections under unusual lighting conditions. Engineers who had worked on OCO's development stated that they had warned about this exact vulnerability during testing, but that schedule pressures and political demands for an operational system had resulted in deployment before all edge cases could be addressed, and the September 26th false alarm vindicated their concerns, while simultaneously exposing the institutional failures that had prioritized technology deployment over thorough validation. Military leadership praised Petrov privately for his technical judgment and his prevention of a potentially catastrophic escalation, but declined to give him any official commendation or public recognition because doing so would require acknowledging that the early warning system had malfunctioned and that Soviet nuclear command and control procedures had nearly failed during a period of already heightened international tension. Petrov received a reprimand in his service record for failing to follow proper protocol during the incident, and while this reprimand was relatively minor compared to the punishment he could have faced if his assessment had been wrong, it effectively ended any possibility of further advancement in his military career. He continued working in the Soviet Air Defense Forces for several more years, but found himself increasingly marginalized within an institution that viewed his actions on September 26th as evidence of unreliability rather than sound judgment, and in 1984, he transferred to a different position where he participated in research on early warning systems without holding command responsibility. The strain of the incident and its aftermath contributed to the breakdown of his marriage, as his wife struggled with the knowledge that her husband had made a decision that could have resulted in their deaths, along with millions of others, if he had been wrong. And they divorced in the mid-1980s while Petrov dealt with what he later described as severe psychological stress from understanding how close the world had come to nuclear war based on a computer error that he had recognized, but that others might not have questioned. Petrov retired from the military in 1993, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union eliminated the strategic systems and command structures he had spent his career working within. He lived in relative poverty in a small apartment near Moscow, receiving a modest military pension that barely covered basic expenses during the economic chaos of post-Soviet Russia. The incident of September 26th remained classified until 1998, when a retired Soviet general mentioned it during an interview, and only then did the world learn how close it had come to nuclear war because of a satellite malfunction, and one officer's decision to trust his judgment over the computer. International recognition followed slowly. The Association of World Citizens gave Petrov an award in 2006. The United Nations invited him to New York in 2000. Documentary filmmakers interviewed him. He received the Dresden Peace Prize in 2013. But he never received significant recognition from the Russian government, which viewed the incident as an embarrassment that highlighted the unreliability of Soviet military systems, rather than as an example of individual heroism deserving celebration. Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017, at the age of 77 in his apartment in Fryazino, a small town outside Moscow. His death went unnoticed for several months, until a German friend who had been trying to contact him eventually learned that he had passed away. He had lived alone, largely forgotten by the country he had served and separated from his two sons who had built their own lives. The man who may have prevented World War III spent his final years in obscurity, his pension barely sufficient, his health declining, his contribution to human survival acknowledged by foreign organizations, but never properly recognized by his own government. History remembers September 26, 1983, as the night when the world did not end because one person understood that computers could be wrong and that protocol should not override reason. But Stanislav Petrov himself described his actions more simply as doing his job correctly when the system he worked within had failed.